we're going to get started now. Happy to introduce the Housing Decommodification Socialist Night School, the first in Central Connecticut, hosted by the lovely Liz, who is our speaker today from the Housing Decommodification Working Group of the Housing Justice Committee of Central Connecticut DSA. So we're going to be talking about the book. Actually, I'll let Liz introduce us, I guess. So Liz, kick it off, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz from Central CT DSA. I'm on the Housing Decommodification Working Group of our Housing Justice Committee. And past few months, we've been discussing why it's important to have a vision for housing that is not bought and sold for the sake of profit, but housing that is accessible to all. As you know, the knowledge that there is a long-running housing crisis came to a forefront in 2008 following the financial crash. And while the media has painted the picture of a rosy recovery, the truth is, for the majority of people, access to housing has become more and more difficult. Can everybody see the screen share going on? Let me holler in the chat if you can't see the screen share. All right. Great. All right, so let's get started. The 3 Ds of DSA's housing justice. Democratize. Tenants and / residents control the decision-making process when it comes to land and housing. Decarbonize, achieving ecological justice and fighting the climate crisis. Housing plays an important part in that, especially as we predict that housing will become a more valuable as climate change progresses. And the 3rd D is decommodified, tonight's topic. So, commodification and inequality make secure housing impossible for many workers. Contrary to the popular line of thought, this is a feature of the so-called housing and real estate markets. This is not the case of the market being interfered with or malfunctioning or whatnot. For market to function effectively, demand must outpace supply. Let's look at how this pans out in Connecticut. The fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is $1,374. A household must earn $4,580 per month, or $54,956 annually. Now let's see, what does that mean you have to earn an hour to afford? $26.42. Now the state minimum wage is currently $11. It's going to be raised to $15 over the next few years. The average renter's wage is $17.70. As you can see here, at minimum wage, the current Connecticut minimum wage, you will have to work for 96 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom rental home at the fair market rent. At minimum wage for a 1-bedroom rental home, you have to work 78 work hours. So, as you can see here, it's not really possible for someone working at minimum wage unless they want to work themselves to death. So this brings us to our next slide. We will define commodity and what causes housing to be priced at a level that most people cannot afford. Well, a commodity, according to Marx's theory, is a product that possesses both use value and exchange value. The product is used to both satisfy human needs, food, water, shelter, clothing, but it can also be exchanged for something else. And in our society, what is exchanged for is currency, capital. So how does commodification alter the role of housing in capitalist society? And how does it affect people's access to housing? That's the questions we have to ask. If you've read the required reading, we can easily, the chapter 1 of In Defense of Housing, we know the answer to that question. Here are the consequences when housing becomes commodified. A house becomes a financial investment, a liquid asset. It's decoupled from its role as shelter. It now fulfills 2 roles because it is a commodity. Because it is now perceived as a commodity, publicly owned homes, publicly owned housing and rent control housing would disappear and be absorbed into the private sector because the industry will lobby for all of that to be deregulated. Then, as we've seen happen for the past several decades, rising prices and predatory real estate practices lead to an increase in housing insecurity for many. And the hoarding of land and real estate by the wealthy few. To quote from In Defense of Housing, under hyper-commodification, all of the material and legal structures of housing, buildings, land, labor, property rights, are turned into commodities. The capacity of a building to function as a home becomes secondary. What matters is how a building functions in circuits of economic accumulation. Then we ask, why must housing be decommodified? And the authors provide us with that answer as well. Ultimately, the problem with making housing a commodity is that as such, living space will be distributed based on the ability to pay and provided to the extent that it produces a profit. But ability to pay is unequal, while the need for a place to live is universal. There is thus an unavoidable contradiction. Again, Marx discusses this quite often, the foundational text of socialism, the contradictions of capitalism. And this is just this happens with agriculture, this happens with water, this happens with any other requirement for human existence that becomes a commodity that is bought and sold. So what alternatives exist? This has been covered, if you've looked at the selected or suggested readings, one of which was communities over commodities. There are alternative housing models that have been developed in response to the inherent inequality of commodified housing and real estate. There are, for instance, community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives. In Germany, they have experimented with a model called tenement syndicates. There's also mutual aid housing cooperatives and resident management corporations for public housing. And public housing, social housing, that is one of the huge battles that needs to be fought in order to work towards decommodification of housing. For example, the People's Policy Project advocates that the housing crisis in the US be solved through social housing. Jacobin had an article about public housing projects across the world, with the epitome being the public housing projects of the Red Vienna era, the city of Vienna. In the US, one of the big campaigns when it comes to decommodified housing is the Homes Guarantee, which proposes that we build millions of units of social housing across the US in order to ensure that everyone has a home. And a champion of the Homes Guarantee in Connecticut, our very own Justin Farmer, ran a campaign recently for the state legislature, and he's currently serving as a legislative counselor in Hamden.
Maybe roll back the slide one more so we can have Justin announce himself. I don't think he needs much introduction. And yeah, Justin, trying to find his name amongst the list. There you go. Hold on, did I lose him?
Oh no.
I don't see his name. He might have disconnected. Oh no.
The downside of Zoom.
Let's give it a minute, I think. Hopefully he'll be back.
Yes, we can give it a sec, and maybe if anybody has any questions about the presentation so far, anybody wants to, or has any questions about the text also, because I know it was a little meaty. Good meaty though.
Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I am happy to answer. I went through the text myself. Red Vienna actually refers more to a time period rather than a location. It was a pre-World War II period of social democratic reform in the city of Vienna, Austria. The public housing projects that were established during these period of social experimentation in Vienna were one of the best in the world. Some of them still stand today. If someone could post the article in the chat, that would be great. I just don't want to get off a screen share, but Jacobin had a great article on public housing across the world. Mhm.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Hey, sorry about that. Give me 2 seconds. Uh, cool.
Yay!
Hey, sorry about that. I am fine. There was a shooting in my neighborhood, so I was talking to the police outside, so I apologize. I was bouncing back and forth. Um, so I missed the tail end of, were you just mentioning me, and the housing policy?
Yes, yes. We're mentioning how you have taken up the homes guarantee as part of your platform.
Cool, yeah. So, in terms of housing, we've recently heard housing is a human right. Um, and I'll even tie this into what just happened. When we talk about housing and when we talk about decommodifying it, um, we have neighborhoods around here. My Connecticut has done something where we have pocketed poverty and created these areas where we've literally locked out people out of opportunities of economic opportunities, transportation, jobs, so on and so forth. Um, and then we claim that it's unsafe. We claim that if you allow for more affordable housing, if the state takes up that process and builds it in other neighborhoods and other communities, that somehow the quality of life will decline. And I would argue the opposite, that the fact that we have continued to pocket poverty in such a way has created a powder keg of issues and a multitude of issues where we have denigrated groups of people, usually people with disabilities, people of color, uh, uh, immigrant communities. We have destituted them in certain ways. So in terms of the policy and the things that we talk about, um, you know, I'm proud of the team I worked with and talked about these issues. Um, Last year, we held a conference in conjunction. Alex Conas was able to get the Yale Law School and the business school to bring in experts all across the country to talk about housing and to talk about how we do things in a more participatory way. And one of the things that I took away from this was just the fact of where does the issue start? The issue starts with that we have about 256,000 people here in Connecticut who are spending more than half of their income for affordable, safe place to stay. Um, and when you look at homeowners, you have tons of homeowners who are just as much destitute in the same situation where they're paying a huge mortgage to the banks. So the issues that we have is this stems back from the 1970s where we stopped having the federal government fund and build projects to house people. Um, when you look at the 1930s onward, we moved away from rooming boards, temporary housing, shelters in that sense, where people have the ability to have a building block and, you know, slowly figure out a way to more stable housing, but have a safe, secure place to stay. The fundamental issue that we have is that housing is a fundamental right uh, that everybody needs to be productive. Whatever you consider productive, everyone needs a house to be able to recuperate, to keep your belongings, to take a bath. All these things are needed to survive and to be able to produce. And the idea that we have linked is that, well, you need to make enough to produce to be able to have a house is backwards because you basically can't actually be a worker. You can't work in any real capacity if you don't have a safe place to stay. Um, and we see this When you think about that, we have 250 some people who are housing insecure, yet we have 170,000 people uh, who are eligible come January 1st to be evicted. 170,000 people. Our largest city in Connecticut is 143,000 people. That is the city of Bridgeport. So that would be if you evicted everyone in the city of Bridgeport and then added another 30,000 people, and that stat is from like a month and a half ago. That is the state of housing of where we are. So some of the things that we talked about in this plan is one, creating. Hold on one second. No, um, um, we we are in a situation right now where if we don't have a plan, all these people can be evicted. But even more so, if we so some of the things. Sorry, I got sidetracked. One of the things that we talked about is having um, a public bank. In Connecticut, having a public bank to fund these projects. Oftentimes, we have private investors who are like, oh, I don't want to take up the liability of public housing, and the returns or investment are like 15, 20 years. I'm like, yeah, it's a long-term investment to make sure that people have to secure housing as a human right. Yes, it's a long-term investment. You do not get rich tomorrow by providing people a place to stay. And frankly, the state should be taking up that charge. We shouldn't be asking private investors to figure out how to help us because they don't care about us. It should be the state taking up that charge. So having a public bank to draw on those funds, to keep interest low, and to be able to really fund the projects that we need. The next thing that we have to do is tackle policy. We have 830G here in Connecticut, which is a housing policy that cuts through some of the red tape that permits local ordinances that permit affordable housing if the municipality has less than 10% affordable housing in its community. The issue with that we've seen is that developers will bait and switch. So they'll build a property, they'll say, yeah, we're going to have 10% affordable housing in these units. We're going to stick to that. And then once they get close to the end, after they've already broke ground, after they already start to move forward, they bait and switch, and then they end up building market rate housing, and now they've cut through inland wetlands. Now they've cut through planning and zoning. Now all of these public opportunities for discourse are cut through, and people don't even have those conversations. Um, so I guess all that to say, I feel like the things that we really need to work on are one, the state needs to figure out how to fund these things. The second thing is we get tons of money from the federal government where we could be putting that towards actually doing the projects ourselves instead of giving the millions of dollars to private entities to do these things. We have tons of people who are skilled, tons of people across the country where we could hire them and actually start to build housing. And then the third thing is Connecticut doesn't have regionalization. We have SCROGs. We have SCROGs and COGs, these municipal business organizations that control mostly transportation funds, and they are the only organizations that think about regionalization in any sense. You cannot have a city like New Haven where every single town around it has NIMBYism and says, not in our backyard, we don't want affordable housing, and then expect issues like homelessness, domestic violence, drug addiction, all these other peripheral issues not to powder keg and to culminate. So it's working to identify local leaders in these other communities and push them and push their communities to allow for affordable housing. Because when you don't, you deal with situations like you have a random shooting in a neighborhood that is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the whole entire state, and yet 5 blocks up from me, I represent some of the richest people in my community, people who literally their properties are millions of dollars, constitutional professors at Yale, and yet somehow you can have this juxtaposition where you have police lights blaring in the background because of shootings, and then you have people who have manicured parks that seem to not be fazed by all that is going on. So I am a little frazzled. I had better thoughts to share with y'all, but my head is in two places. Um, so I don't know. I don't know if there's any questions that I missed in the chat.
Just running through real quick. I think someone. Nope. Looks like they got their question answered. Cool. Yeah, if anybody has any questions other than saying thank you, Justin, I know everybody's really happy to see you. And giving our best to whoever's dealing with that police violence over there. Obviously, I don't know what happened right now, but please, definitely.
Yeah,
Thanks
everybody
so
is
much.
good. Everybody's good. Everybody's safe. So thank y'all for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this work.
Thank you so much for speaking, Justin. It was thank you very much.
Next up, we have Breakout Groups, which I think I have successfully sorted everyone into. If you have not been properly sorted, you will be stuck with me with my DSA 12 line account. I can't hear anybody on that account, so if you're left, just wait 1 minute and I will sort you out. If you want to progress to the next slide, please, just so I can show off the questions. Thank you so much. So yeah, we got a couple questions and we have a couple facilitators. I believe every breakout group has a facilitator. Basically, we just want everybody to engage with these questions for 15 to 20 minutes-ish. Then we'll reconvene before 7:30 so we can all leave at a reasonable time. So if anybody from my breakout group wants to kick us off, please go ahead.
Sure, I can.
Cool.
We kind of started out with talking about the fact that the idea of a tenant right, can be more than just someone who has a landlord, right? It's the relationship to housing. So, if you're homeless, your tenant's the city, right? If you have a mortgage, right, your tenant's, or sorry, if you're homeless, your landlord's the city. If you have a mortgage, your landlord's the bank, right? And just touching on the idea that a tenant's kind of an unwilling debtor, right? Because that you have to pay for housing no matter what. We kind of brought this on to talking kind of about the connection to property taxes in schools, right? And then how housing kind of has a connection to violence, both in the violence people will use to protect their housing, as well as the violence the state uses to enforce, and evict people from housing. And then kind of touch on a little more of a hopeful note around housing as an opportunity for people to kind of coalesce around this concept of debt. Is something that maybe people will start pushing back on more.
Awesome. Any other groups want to
go? I'll go from, I think we were the second breakout group. So we talked about what brought us to this space. A number of us talked about how we've been enraged by what's been going on with housing during the pandemic, particularly, and specifically, for example, evictions even occurring during the crisis, and how this is a deeply radicalizing experience. We then talked about sort of contrasts we see in terms of housing development. On the one hand, we see these luxury developments, we see these very expensive homes, and then just a little bit away, within even walking distance, you'll step into a neighborhood that has not been provided for and cared for in any way. And then we talked a little bit more about our experiences as tenants, as well as the need to sort of recognize or have some class consciousness as tenants, that we've been in situations as individuals where we've been able to negotiate with landlords, but have not done so on the basis of working alongside in solidarity with other tenants. And what is it that we could maybe accomplish if we actually did that? For example, through tenants associations or tenants unions. And finally, we really ended on a note of our ideal housing situation. And we talked about one in which housing, its provisioning, its building, its sustaining is one where we actually have a real say in. One where to be a tenant doesn't mean to be subordinate to a landlord, but to really be in relation to each other in that way. And also that public and social housing, but especially public housing, at least in this country, is often taken to be as something that's not, that's drab, that's not taken care of, that's not what many really want to see themselves in, and that we can counter that public housing can be beautiful, and there are examples of that. So that's largely what we had talked about.
That's great. So we got 2 more breakout groups. We have another New Haven-ish group and a Hartford-ish group. Anybody wants to go for one of those?
So yeah, I'll go for group number 3. Basically, we talked about challenges, I think, in living in apartments, challenges that result from neglect of landlords or maintenance of the owners of such buildings. We talked about what we might want to see in housing, and about why the problem under Corona is, I think, intensifying for people, even if you've already been doing this kind of work. We talked about how an ideal for housing seems to be something that would make the housing more cooperative or democratize the housing for all of us. That seemed to be resonant, and that it ought to be something that that maybe the ecology, the context of ecology, is really going to inform housing moving forward. That seemed to be said a few times. I think that's pretty much the summation. We talked about working with the unhoused and approaches to that, or how some of us have worked with that challenge. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then the final, the power group, Maureen, Justin, etc.
I can go if no one else wants to. So we talked about a few different things that I thought were really helpful. A lot of people in our group really viewed everything as like an interconnected, which I think was really helpful. So people brought in ecology, kind of starting with the first question, and how our current housing situation, both in like the wealthier neighborhoods where we have, I guess for lack of a better word, McMansions, and then the poorer neighborhoods, like both have their own ecological issues and their own issues that keep us from connecting in a community, and also reinforce racism and violence both in terms of like how far apart things are from each other. So whether or not folks can access groceries in their neighborhood, whether they have to get cars, whether they have equitable public transit options. So all of this being like inherently connected. And we talked some about our own experiences as tenants and the sort of inhumanity, I guess, of being required to pay money and that being your only option for if you want to live in a house. You have to pay money to do that or live in a dwelling. And I think overall, I just really appreciated how like the intersections were really well discussed within our group. And then we talked sort of, when we got towards solutions, we talked definitely about like taxation and other things that we can use. Public banking was another thing that was brought up as options to help us move towards better housing situation.
That's awesome. So that concludes our breakout report backs. Everybody, thank you so much for all that. Do you want to hop over to the next slide, I think, if you're still screen sharing, Liz?
Yes, I'm still screen sharing. Can everyone see?
Cool. So yeah, so we're going to wrap up, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.